Montreal was Canada's largest city until Toronto surpassed it in the 1970s. Most people outside Canada do not know this, and it turns out to be the most important fact about why Montreal feels the way it does. Everything about how a city develops, its street grid, its building stock, its density, its transit infrastructure, was set before the car became the dominant planning assumption. The older the city at the moment when car-centric sprawl takes over, the more of the pre-car city survives into the present. Montreal's central city is dense and walkable because it was already a major city before anyone decided that walkability was something cities could afford to lose. That inherited foundation is the starting point. What Montreal has done with it over the past decade is the argument. Let's start with the cycling. The REV, the Réseau Express Velo, is a 191-kilometer protected bike network planned across 17 routes on the island of Montreal. The first section opened on Rue Saint-Denis in November 2020. Since then, the network has expanded to Peel Street, Henri Bourassa, Jean Talon, and several other corridors, with $30 million invested in cycling infrastructure in 2024 alone, covering 29 new projects. Before the REV even existed, Montreal already had over 1,083 kilometers of bikeways on the island. BIXE, the city's bike share system, operates approximately 934 stations and 11,000 bikes, including 2,600 electric bikes, and recorded 13 million trips in 2024, a record. Montreal is hosting the 2026 UCI Road World Championships. What makes this genuinely different from most cycling investments in U.S. cities is not the total kilometers, but the philosophy behind the design. The REV routes are wide enough for cyclists to pass each other, protected from traffic, and maintained year-round, including in winter. They are designed for people who are not enthusiasts, because the goal is to make cycling a default rather than a hobby. In most comparable American cities, protected bike infrastructure is still being contested corridor by corridor, with each proposal requiring years of public hearings and political fights over a few blocks of paint and a planter box. Montreal builds express cycling highways across the whole island. The transit expansion is the other piece of infrastructure that few American cities at this scale have matched recently. The REM, the Réseau Express Métropolitain, is a 64-kilometer automated light metro system, similar in design to the Vancouver SkyTrain, that opened on July 31, 2023. It has 23 stations currently operational, with more under construction. Current daily ridership sits at approximately 78,000, projected to reach 190,000 at full capacity. Combined with the Montreal Metro, which carried 977,800 weekday riders in the fourth quarter of 2025, Montreal is in the middle of the most significant transit expansion it has seen in decades. The comparison to American cities does not require embellishment. Most comparable American metros have not opened a new rapid transit line in years. Many are still fighting over funding for extensions that have been planned since the early 2000s. Montreal opened a new automated metro system and is running it. The city itself is the other half of the transit story. Before you can build transit that works, you need density that justifies it and destinations close enough together to make it attractive. Montreal's inherited urban fabric provides both. The REV and the REM are expansions on top of a foundation that was already there, which is why they work rather than becoming the expensive, underused infrastructure that transit in sprawling American cities tends to become. The neighborhoods are where the lived experience of the city becomes impossible to explain through statistics alone. Every major American city markets its neighborhoods as distinct. In most cases, this means different real estate branding applied to adjacent blocks of similar development. Montreal's neighborhoods are actually distinct in ways that are physically and socially legible at street level. Verdun, Griffintown, NDG, Côte-des-Neiges, Saint-Léonard, Villeray, Rosemont, the Plateau, each has a different architectural era, a different street scale, a different mix of languages and communities. Some were independent cities until 2002, when a forced amalgamation brought them into the city of Montreal, and some, like Westmount, resisted amalgamation entirely and remain independent cities within the island to this day. Outremont has a significant Yiddish-speaking minority that has shaped its commercial streets for generations. Saint Leonard has a large Italian-Canadian community that produces its own trilingual commercial fabric. Côte des Neiges is one of the most diverse neighborhoods in Canada by almost any measure. The mountain, the river, and the canals create physical separations between areas that make moving from one neighborhood to another feel like crossing a genuine threshold rather than a zoning boundary. McGill and the Université de Montreal are not far apart on a map, but they feel like different worlds because the mountain and the language differences between them create real separation. This is not a marketing claim. It is what actually happens when you walk from one neighborhood to the next. You can spend weeks exploring the island and not run out of things that feel genuinely new, which is not something most North American cities of comparable population can say honestly. Chicago comes close, most cannot. The park culture is subtler than the cycling infrastructure, but in some ways more telling about what kind of city Montreal actually is. Parks in most American cities serve one of two functions. Either they are recreational facilities with scheduled activities and equipment, or they are passive green space where people sit in proximity to other people without actually interacting with them. Montreal parks function as shared backyards. People have picnics and barbecues, impromptu music appears. Strangers end up talking to each other, not because an event was organized for that purpose, but because the space invites it. Drinking beer or wine with a meal is legal and generally tolerated even without food, which is a permission most American and English Canadian cities do not extend, and that turns out to matter more than it sounds. The legal permission to be genuinely social in a park, rather than merely present in one, changes who shows up, when they show up, and how long they stay. Parc La Fontaine on a Friday evening, the Lachine Canal on a summer weekend, Parc Jerry during a neighborhood festival. These are places where the city feels alive, in the specific way that makes you understand what people mean when they say a city has energy. A city where people already experience public outdoor space this way is more receptive to pedestrianization, to protected bike lanes, to taking back road space from cars, because the idea of public space as a genuinely social environment is not abstract to anyone who has spent a summer there. The housing culture in Montreal is different from comparable American cities in a way that is hard to measure, but easy to feel in the political debate. Montreal has more renters than Toronto, and Montrealers tend to treat rising housing prices as a burden rather than an investment opportunity. In Toronto's housing debates, a significant portion of the conversation involves homeowners treating price appreciation as exciting news and downplaying the affordability problem for people who do not own. In Montreal, rising prices are more consistently discussed as something that pushes people out and makes the city harder to live in, not as proof that the local market is healthy. This is partly because more people experience rising prices as tenants paying more rather than as owners watching their net worth increase. It is also partly a deeper cultural difference in how housing is understood, one that runs through the whole province and shapes the political debate in ways that English Canadian cities simply do not have. The honest complication is that this cultural attitude has not prevented prices from rising. Montreal rents climbed 5.9% in 2025, nearly 10% over 2 years. The gap with American cities on affordability is narrowing, but the political culture around the problem remains meaningfully different, which affects what kinds of policy interventions are possible. Montreal also has the worst doctor access of any major Canadian metropolitan area. Approximately 32% of Montreal residents do not have a family doctor. The comparable figure for Toronto is roughly 9%. The PRIAM system concentrates the problem in central Montreal by limiting where newly licensed doctors can practice. Wait times for a family doctor through the provincial registry run 2 years or more, and that estimate turns out to be optimistic for many people. This is not a recent spike. It is a persistent structural problem that has existed for years and has not been solved by any of the provincial policy interventions aimed at it. For Anglophones arriving in Montreal, French is both genuinely enriching and a real employment barrier. Making solid progress in French is not the same as competing with someone who grew up in the province. And a meaningful proportion of people who put years into intensive French programs still find professional employment difficult to secure. Treating French as simply a matter of effort and willingness undersells how significant the gap between acquired and native fluency is in a professional context. The cleanliness issues are less severe but visible. Plex housing produces garbage bags on sidewalks each week because the buildings were built for 6 units on a narrow lot, not for the centralized garbage infrastructure a large apartment building would have. Low-effort graffiti tags accumulate on signs and over more considered street art. The city has real murals that add character and real tagging that is just litter in spray paint form. Parks that are vibrant on Saturday night tend to look like it on Sunday morning. And the winters are substantially worse than Toronto's, much worse than Vancouver's, and dramatically worse than any American Sunbelt city that someone from the US might be using as their reference point. Montreal does its best with winter, with skating and skiing and outdoor markets, but there is no version of January in Montreal that someone from Atlanta would voluntarily choose. Montreal is better at these specific things because it never stopped being a city. Most of the American metros it outperforms on cycling, transit, neighborhood variety, and park culture were either never as dense to begin with or actively dismantled their density during the post-war decades and have spent the years since trying to recover it. Montreal did not dismantle what it had. It maintained it and, in the past decade, built substantially on top of it. The foundation for all of it was inherited. Montreal was a major city before the car took over. That head start produced a street grid, a building stock, and a density that no amount of new urbanism investment has fully managed to recreate from scratch in Houston or Phoenix or Charlotte, cities that were built during and after the automobile era and now spend billions trying to add back what they chose to remove. The head start is the answer to why Montreal is better at these specific things. It is also the reminder that the cities currently trying to build what Montreal inherited are working at a disadvantage that better policy alone cannot fully close. Because you cannot retrofit a century of pre-car urbanism onto a city that was designed after the car arrived.